Alright, we'll get started. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to our special guests. I welcome you all to today's event as part of the Islamic Awareness Week organized by SUMSA. The debate with the motion, God has a role in politics, co-organized with the newly formed Atheist Society of Sydney Uni. So to start, God and politics are, by assumption in a secular society, not supposed to mix. The separation of church and state is a fundamental pillar of modern secular democratic states. Now, what are the underlying reasons for this position, and how do they stand up to rational scrutiny? And with realities like the atheism of Gillard and the Christianity of Abbott being made a point of in the current election campaign, is this separation being compromised? On the other side of the scale, Islam doesn't recognize the separation in the first instance, holding for God an overriding role in all aspects of life, including politics. For over 1,000 years, the Islamic Caliphate saw the arguably successful mixing of spirituality and politics. So, what are the rational justifications for this position, and what is the proof that God exists in the first instance? So these are the pertinent questions our speakers will answer and discuss today. So once again, the motion of this debate is God has a role in politics. On the affirmative side will be Muslim speaker Uthman Badar. Now, to give a background on Uthman Badar, he is a student of economics. He graduated from USyd with a Bachelor of Commerce, majoring in finance and economics. He then completed an honours year at UWS and is currently undertaking a PhD at the same university in the research area of Islamic economics. He is also a student of Arabic and the Islamic sciences, having variously pursued part-time study over the last 8 years of various Islamic sciences, including theology, logic, jurisprudence, principles of jurisprudence, Quran and Hadith studies, and Islamic political thought. At the same time, he is a political activist as a senior member and the local media representative of Hizb ut-Tahrir, a global Islamic political party working for positive political change in the Muslim world in the form of an Islamic caliphate. Now, on the negative side will be atheist speaker Joseph Daroczy. Joseph is the current president of the Brazilian Philosophy Society and the newly formed Atheist Society at Sydney University. He is an author of various atheist, rationalist and futurist blogs, and Joseph is currently studying psychology, philosophy, neuroscience here at the University of Sydney. He was born into a Catholic family, but in his own words, converted out as soon as possible. He is also an avid follower of science and skepticism. Now to introduce the format of the debate. The debate will be split up into 20-minute primary arguments for each speaker. Speaker A will speak for 20 minutes and present his primary argument, and Speaker B will then follow through and speak for 20 minutes with his primary argument. And then Speaker B will come forward again and give a 10-minute response, followed by Speaker A giving his 10-minute response. Afterwards, we'll have a 2.5-minute concluding remark from each speaker, starting from Speaker A and then followed by Speaker B. After this, we'll open the floor for questions. Now, at this debate, we will primarily be taking questions through written form, so there will be people going around with palm cards and pens, and so if you have any questions, please write them down and we'll collect them at the end. And if time permits, we'll also open the floor up for oral questions. Now, a few house rules. I'd like to emphasize that while the topic may invoke some emotion, at no time are members of the audience welcome to interrupt the speakers. Please show respect and write questions on paper provided, which will be answered in given time. Another thing about the speakers, timing will be strictly adhered to. If any of the speakers go beyond the 25 minutes, sorry, I said 20 minutes, I should have said 25. 25 minutes of their primary argument, the amount of time will be deducted from the response. I would like to now call upon Speaker A, who will be the affirmative speaker, Uthman Badar, to present his primary argument.
Good afternoon, everyone. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. We begin by the praise of Allah, the creator of all that exists, and by seeking His peace and blessings for the last and final of the messengers He sent for the entirety of mankind. We have a very interesting motion in front of us today. God has a role in politics. Politics, of course, is a much abused word. In fact, even a much abused pastime, both in terms of the understanding and the application. It was Sir Ernest Benn, a British writer and publisher of the early 20th century, who said that politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it whether it exists or not, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedy. And perhaps we can understand where he's coming from, given the current election campaign and the likes of which we have seen in the past. Of course, that is not politics in its essence, that is the abuse of politics. Politics in its essence, at least in the Islamic tradition, is at its essence, at the broadest of levels, to do with the management of affairs, to do with the management of the affairs of people, of society. And even in the Western tradition, politics has a similar meaning at essence, but it's slightly more connected to issues of state and society, civic affairs, and so forth. And in fact, that sort of tale that goes around about politics being a composite of poly and ticks, meaning many blood-sucking parasites, has no etymological basis whatsoever. Right? So sorry to bring that to your attention. In fact, even in English, it comes from Middle English, from Latin and from Greek, meaning the issues of state and society and the management of affairs. And so obviously, if politics is as Sir Ernest Benn says, then God doesn't have a role in that sort of those sort of affairs. But if it's about dealing with the issues of human beings, then certainly I will argue that God has an overriding role. And that's probably better that way. The outline of my argument will be as follows. I'm going to present a brief context which I think is important, but my primary argument is broadly as follows: that our actions, this is my premise, that our actions should be informed by reality, and that reality at the highest of levels is that God exists. So I'll present my argument for that, and obviously that has certain implications. It's very simple. I present that first, just so once we get into the details, we don't get lost as to where exactly this is going. What I mean by context is, I think certain things need to be made very clear. There are certain myths that are peddled on this topic and on related issues. One particular one, implicit more often than not, is of the superiority of Western civilization. And so I want to have a quick look at that. Obviously, there's a lot of very nice, colourful words are used. Western secular civilization, rule of law, freedom, human rights, democracy, civilization, economic advancement. And generally these concepts are taken at face value. The reality, of course, is very different if we go beyond a superficial analysis. So certainly, yes, rule of law, we're lectured about rule of law, but we've been given the likes of Guantanamo Bay. We're lectured about freedom, but as soon as you have a different opinion, you're an extremist, you're a radical. Some of you may have seen my interview with Tracy Grimshaw about a month ago. She didn't like the fact that I had a different opinion about democracy. So she was saying, you're exploiting your democratic freedoms to speak against democracy. We're elected about human rights, but we've been given the likes of Abu Ghraib and Bagram Air Base. We're lectured about democracy, yet Western governments are more than happy to cuddle up with the most heinous despots of our age. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Musharraf before that, Uzbekistan, so on and so forth. Economic advancement, it's only come at the expense of millions and millions of people and their livelihoods. And that's the advancement that we've actually had, the reality of which itself is that it's quite superficial, as we've seen, that it's only a matter of time before a crisis has to come along and bring everyone back down to earth. So I think this is important. It's just that sometimes the secular platform is given superiority for no reason. It's just that lies have been peddled and the superficial assessments have been propagated. Of course, the great mistake of the Enlightenment, which is where secularism sort of emanates from, was the rejection of God, where the imperative really was to reject the church. For the Enlightenment is liberation of people from the oppression of Europe at the time, which was emanating from the church. Right? But the result was the rejection of God. The conflation, of course, is that the church or Christianity is religion. Of course, that's not true. Christianity is just one claim to religion. And so what we see from this in the last 2 or 3 centuries has been the imposition of European history, intellectual development and experiences universally. And that's fallacious, because it's a specific experience. All right? And so if you have a bad time with people who are using God to oppress you, you cannot from that come with a general conclusion to say that religion and politics do not mix. You can say Christianity and politics do not mix. All right? That's an argument, although still you need a bit more than one experience, but you certainly can't make a general conclusion, as has unfortunately been made. The result has been that under the leadership of the West, governments, policymakers in particular, directly or through their agents in the Muslim world, in the so-called Third World, the reality is that the world has witnessed untold misery on an untold scale. And certainly we can talk about various details, but we don't have time for that. Certainly happy to go into this in question and answers. But things like imperialism, wars, unending wars, crime rates, poverty, world poverty is at alarming levels and it's only growing. Economic exploitation, social decay. And some of these things are actually not known. Like there's wars go on, everyone knows that. You can't miss it. But things like social decay, to quote from, this is a report from the Children's Society in the UK, and it says that Britain and the US have more broken families than other countries. Right, Britain and the US, the leaders of the free world. And our families are less cohesive in the way they live and eat together. British children are rougher with each other and live more riskily in terms of alcohol, drugs and teenage pregnancy. And they're less inclined to stay in education. This comes against the background of much greater income inequality. Many more children live in relative poverty in Britain and the US. Right, and that's in terms of children. What about the grown-ups? Well, Justice Coleridge is a judge in the family division. Again, I use the UK as an example because it's, I think it's more representative than more of an outlier like Australia or others, though certainly there are distinctions. But he says, commenting on what he faces day to day, that there is a never-ending carnival of human misery, a ceaseless river of human distress. Talking about social and family breakdown. What is the point? Obviously, people can argue, yeah, look, bad things happen. They happen in the Muslim world as well. They've happened in the past. What's the point? The point is that a lot of this consequence is inevitably rooted in the ideals that are being propagated, which is the issue that we are debating here today. Right? So things like the maximization of personal benefit, which is the cornerstone or the objective set out by secularism. Effectively the worship of the individual. Right? God's been thrown out, but that's just replaced one thing being worship with another one, and that happens to be the individual. Again, that's based on a slight fallacy. individualism itself, because it looks at the human being from the atomist perspective as being an abstract entity divorced from its social reality, which is obviously wrong, because the social reality is very, very important in terms of what individuals believe and what they value and how they look at things. And on the level of international policy or foreign affairs, there's the worship of the nation-state, which puts states against states, as going back to the worship of the individual puts the individual against the collective. There's also in the absence of God, there's a subjective morality. And I'm not using this to say that therefore God exists. That's a fallacious argument, right? It's just to say these are the ideals that are being propagated, and that's why the consequence is as it is. It's subjective because there is absolutely no objective basis whatsoever to say this is good, this is evil. It's just what you think and what he thinks and what everyone else thinks, right? Although others have been proposed, but certainly not up to scratch. Moving forward then, what we propose is that one ideology should not be judged through the prism of another. And again, we have this a lot in Western commentary on Islam and other religions, where things are questioned. Oh, you do this, you've got barbaric punishments, you do this to women, X, Y, Z, with the assumption implicitly, if not explicitly, is that secular liberalism is right. It's correct. Why are you doing things differently? Right? And that's obviously completely unacceptable, because we want to debate first whether it's right or not. You cannot make that assumption. Rather, a more objective approach is to look at the original question, which can be studied in numerous ways, but one of which is to say that, look, people have values which guide them in life, guiding principles. Societies do. We need to look for those values, that value set, which is more conducive for a more harmonious existence, a harmonious social existence, because human beings are social creatures who live together in societies. Right? What's the criteria for this? I propose, and we can obviously have a debate on this, that these values should be rational, they should be based in a rational creed, right? Which should be a rational assessment of the reality. Right? What is the reality? With evidence. Then they should be cohesive, then they should allow for a cohesive existence, in the sense that they evoke ideas for positive behaviour, right? And they allow cohesion in society. And they should be consistent in two meanings. One, that they should emanate from that creed, right? So there has to be, if you have an idea, if you're saying this is the reality of the world, then you need to go to the rational extensions of that. Right? You need to take things forward. You can't stop and say, well, this is a bit problematic, let's have what are called leaps of faith. And other thing in terms of consistency is application. It should be applied consistently. In which field there can always be deficiencies, right, on either side, but it ideally should still be the case. Now, when we look at Islam, we posit that it has the unique ability to bring tranquility in all of life's affairs, because it does match these three criteria. Right? It also has an objective morality, and that allows for that coherence. And its laws reinforce key values, which are expressed in the Islamic tradition as the protection of life, wealth, mind, lineage, and ideology or deen. And through this, this allows for the working together of what in other traditions, secularism in particular, there's a lot of conflict between the personal and the political, between the religious and the scientific, between rationality and God, spirituality and materialism, tradition and modernity, religion and advancement, the individual and the collective, even things like black and white, young and old, etc. Right now, I'm just making that point there. It certainly needs more substantiation than that, but I will leave that for Q&A later. How am I going to have time? It does.
15 minutes.
Right. Yeah, 15.
12 minutes.
Oh, I've just got 3 minutes taken off me. That's alright. Okay, I got about 12 minutes to prove the existence of God. Should be about enough. Okay. Yeah, look, just before I get to that, as I said, the premise that I'm going off here, because someone can ask, we don't need to prove anything, we can do whatever we want. You can. But I want to posit that our actions should be based on an assessment of reality. Right? And I don't think any sane person should disagree with that. Obviously that means you use your intellect, you use your mind. Unfortunately, it has to be said on the basis of evidence. Now, on top of evidence, obviously there are various considerations again, which epistemological considerations and others that again we don't have time for, but I want to make them explicit anyway, just so it's not thought that these are sort of, being ignored. So obviously evidence is questions of standards, certainty, balance of probabilities. There's the onus of proof, who is it on? And then I think this is very important, and this is missed, especially because we have that sort of question of science and religion, oh my God, what's happening there, sort of thing. It's a very important distinction between rational and empirical thought that I usually spend a lot of time on these presentations, but because I only have 20 minutes, I'm not going to do that. But just the point that the nature of thought, rational and empirical, and their limitations need to be understood before we can use them credibly, let me say. But let me move on anyway to the existence of God in the 10 or so minutes that I have. In fact, there are many arguments for the existence of God. And again, I say this here because, again, there's another myth out there that God can only be proven, or he can't be proven. It's just a matter of faith. What that means, I don't know. It sort of means that you just, you sort of cross your fingers, and when you die and wake up, it could be right, it could be wrong. Right? That has no legitimacy in Islam whatsoever. It has some in other traditions. But there are many arguments, rational arguments for the existence of God. There's the cosmological one, which is an argument by causation. There's the Kalam cosmological one, which is the original Islamic contribution on this topic, and that's an argument from contingency and temporality. Funky words we again don't have time to discuss. There's the argument by design, and there's also a moral argument. All of them make their case, but with differing strengths and differing levels of being open to critique. Right? So the one I'm going to present, which is a variation of the Kalam cosmological argument, it's not one of these, it's a variation, is one I believe is the strongest and least open to critique. There are many retorts on this question of the existence of God. As I said, people say it's not even possible, it's just a matter of faith. God is not necessary. Why should we bother with the discussion? There's so much evil in the world. As long as we're good people, it doesn't matter. We can't sense God, therefore God doesn't exist, and so forth. Again, I just want to explicitly note them. Not that I'm going to be able to deal with all of them, but if you think, I don't think any of them are worthy of a response, to be honest. But if you do, I'll be happy to take that, as I said, in question and answers. The argument I'm going to put forth in the remaining 8 or so minutes that I probably have is as follows. In effect, it's just proving the existence of something we cannot sense by things that we can sense. Alright? I'm showing rationally that there's no other way these things can be as they are. And you can use any example. Observe something, anything. We can use an example of a tree. One of the nice trees that have long been beautifying the background of Sydney University, perhaps. And what you observe about this tree, or anything else, is that it is limited, and it's also dependent. What does that mean? It means that it's limited means it's finite, since some of its restrictions are inherent and unavoidable. Size, length, width, breadth, colour, etc. And it's dependent in that it cannot exist, come into existence, or maintain its existence except by some sort of dependence on other than itself. Other things, water, sunlight, soil, etc. What does that mean? That's obvious, those things. What does that imply? Well, we'll go forward with the dependence point. If this tree is dependent on something, it can either be dependent on one of three things. Right? Within this understanding of things as being limited and dependent. Right? It can be dependent on other limited things, as we said, sunlight, soil, and others. It can be dependent on itself. Right? These are just the logical possibilities at this stage, or some unlimited thing, which at this stage, needs to be substantiated. But certainly, as a logical possibility, it needs to be put down. So the argument is very simple. It's that because an infinite regress or an absolute cyclical dependency cannot actually exist, the options A and B are eliminated, leaving us only with option C. All right? So, just to expand on that point, what do I mean by an infinite regression? An infinite regression or infinite regress is a regression of a series of dependencies to infinity, like so forth. So to say that A is dependent on B, which is dependent on C, which is dependent on D, which is dependent on E, on F, and you keep going forever. I don't have time for that, obviously.
Time, 5 minutes.
Okay, well, not forever, 5 minutes. But you get the point. It keeps going without end. And so with our tree example, So if we can look at the tree, this is very one-dimensional. We can have a very nice multi-dimensional diagram if this you want. The tree depends on sunlight, for example. Sunlight is a process of photosynthesis which requires carbon dioxide, which has covalent bonding, which requires atoms and electrons, angular momentum, positrons, space energy. And we could actually, and this is one, as I said, the tree requires water, we can go on another one. It requires soil, we can go on another one. Right? The only thing that limits us is, or depends on the person who's doing it, not myself, my lack of expertise in science, physics and chemistry, or the collective human limitation in these areas. Right? Otherwise, we could keep going. Now, and so obviously what infinite regression implies is that the whole series has to exist simultaneously without a beginning. Right? If it's like this. Otherwise, if you don't end, going back to the A, B, C, D, E, F, if you don't end, you don't have A. Right? Because if A depends on B, it depends on C, and you keep going, and this sort of thing that's not going to end is not going to get the thing which it needs, right? And we're not going to have A, or B, or C. Nothing's going to exist. Right? If it doesn't end, nothing exists. Okay? And there's various analogies that can be useful for this. Now, there's important, I guess, slight distinction here between, because on the question of infinity, people have done it in maths and whatnot, so they're thinking, well, why can't it be infinite? There's an important distinction between the potential infinite, which is an idea, and the actual infinite in terms of reality, which doesn't exist in our perceivable world. Right? And prominent mathematicians have noted this point, David Hilbert, as well as Kasner and Newman more recently. So, for example, they say the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Existence in the mathematical sense is wholly different from the existence of objects in the physical world. We can use other examples, but I think the point is made. Again, some may say we don't have to go linear. Why can't you have a circle? Well, you can't have a circle unless, again, you will need an external initiator, because if A depends on B, or B depends on A, and A depends on C, and C depends on B, effectively B depends on itself. Right? B depends on itself. It can't bring itself into existence if it's not there, and it needs itself to be there. Right? Therefore, the only possibility is that there has to be an unlimited and independent cause, if I use the word, but I might use the word cause because we go into all those cosmological issues. Obviously, people will say, okay, maybe, but does that mean it's God in the biblical sense or in the Quranic sense? No, it doesn't. We need to still go forward. But what you see is by this very proof, by rational extension, certain attributes are necessary. Right? So, for example, this being has to be a necessary existence. It cannot be contingent, it cannot be simply possible. Because if it's simply possible, again, it has a beginning, we're back into a regress. Right? It has to have a will. Right? Why does it have to have a will? Because it's the one which is determining these limitations and dependencies, these attributes of all these things. And so it has to have the will to actually do this. It has to have power to bring them into form. Right? Having the will is just a determination, but bringing it into reality, it needs the ability. Knowledge, because without knowledge, the power and will, you can't do anything. And it also has to be one. in a very strict sense. In a very, very strict sense.
Time, 1 minute.
In a very strict sense. Again, because if there's two, one of them is sufficient to deal with our problem of mental regress and the other one becomes dismissible. Right? And again, just in that last point there, the Trinity is not able to be just substantiated on this point alone. Because it's 3 on 1 or 1 on 3, but it's not one in a strict sense. So in conclusion, we established on pure basis of rationality, I didn't quote anything from the Quran or the Hadith or anything else, a limitless, powerful and sentient being who brought everything, the universe meaning everything, into existence, otherwise commonly known in the English language as God. But obviously it's not the word that's important, it's the meaning, and I might continue from there later on. But the rest of my argument is very simple. God exists in this sense, with these attributes. He has an overriding role in all aspects of life, including politics. But again, we can expand on that as we move along. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Uthman, you were penalised 10 seconds there. I'd like to call upon Joseph, who will present the negative argument to the motion. He will be giving a 25-minute primary argument, after which we'll go into the responses, where Joseph will be the first to provide his response to Uthman's primary argument. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
Alrighty then.
Now, as the negative, I don't think this title should surprise you. My claim today is that there is no place for God in politics. Whether he is currently used or not is, I hope, not the question, but whether he should be. Capital H for he, I assume. Now, if we are following a God, the real question is, how do we follow him? If there is a God there, and if we agree that it is the Abrahamic God for, say, hypothetical scenarios here, and we interpret the same God differently amongst people. Now, I'm not saying anyone wrote things inaccurately, heaven forbid. I'm just saying that human error may have come into circumstance somewhere, and someone may have misinterpreted this one God. Now, if it's possible to misinterpret one God, and we are to follow one God, where does this lead us in such political conflicts as the Gaza Strip? Now, I'm not saying who is or isn't right, who is or isn't wrong. I'm just saying it's the same Abrahamic God. Just leave that one hanging. Now, a different scenario entirely. There is a Christian faith, a smaller faith, a small sect called Church of the Latter-day Saints, and also known as the Mormons, and they have some kind of weird scenarios leading up to their particular belief. Basically, there was this guy called John Smith. Now, he was a pretty average guy. I think he worked similar to the patent office, like Einstein, but without the quantum theory. Basically, he went out to the woods and came back one day and said, an amazing thing happened. I spoke to the Archangel Gabriel. He gave me a golden tablet. He taught me how to translate the golden tablet, which I've now forgotten how to do, but it doesn't matter because I wrote it all down, then memorized it, then came back, and now I'm willing to recite it for you so that my wife can write it down again. And that will be the new Bible. And that's what John Smith said. And these tablets apparently buried them, but they weren't found. But it doesn't really matter whether they were or weren't found or went missing. Point is, you can't actually provide the basis for a story. And then the book told them to wear strange clothes. And on from that, about 130 years of chanting and praising and believing everything that was written in this book, and he became a prophet. Now, John Smith had quite a nice trajectory. He went from everyday worker to a prophet. Now, those guys surely must be a little weird, you know. Some crazy underwear that they have to wear, some book written down from a golden tablet, some guy who translated things and then couldn't remember how to translate them again, couldn't find the tablets, a whole bunch of inconsistencies. But we don't need to question that, do we? In a rationality-based argument, there are just things. There are beliefs. There is an end to the chain of questioning. But surely that's just the Christians. On from that. The Mormons, to follow the example along, had an interesting scenario about 70 years ago, I think. The US government had a lot of debate about the fact that they didn't explicitly say no polygamy in their constitution. Now, they had to change some things. They had to put forward some laws, argue out how it was going to be worded. That took a couple of months. But right before it was announced, the God of the Mormon Church, who I assume is also the Abrahamic God, interpreted one way, told them that they didn't have polygamy either. Maybe it was a typo, maybe God changed his mind. But either way, he came down, spoke directly, behind closed doors, of course. I mean, that would be silly if he came out in person. But he spoke directly to them and said, "You shall not practice polygamy." Kind of queer. 2 days later, the government said no polygamy, and if you do engage in a polygamous relationship, it's legal, and you could serve jail time. That was very convenient, but the question is, why not earlier? Why did God find out so late? Bit post hoc. And that is often the way we see God in politics. It's often via someone else behind closed doors. George Bush was led by God, apparently. George Bush said he had God in his ear, quite literally. He said, "I have had a message from God, and he says that we are on the right side in this war." Various other people said exactly the same thing about the same Abrahamic God to say that he was wrong. Many people fight and die against one another, both hearing from God. And this is politics, and this is war. So, democracy in politics. If we say that fair is fair, and everyone in a particular political system should have a vote, which is the raw basis of democracy, whether that is how it's practiced or not, then basically we need a voice for all people. So, where is the place for a God in a world where no one agrees what he's saying? If we have, hypothetically, a multicultural country with various interpretations of various books, various beliefs, various ideas on every single situation that comes up in society. We have atheists, we have Muslims, Christians, Jews. We have many different ways of interpreting that particular God, and then we go out to the Raelians and the Scientologists and every other apparent religion that comes up. Now, if democracy is a voice for the people and everyone has an equal vote, and that seems, to me at least, and to the Greeks and to everyone who's had quite a good idea about democracy ever since, seems everyone should have one vote per person, no more and no less. Then relying on one religion, albeit one God, seems that it's cutting out a portion of democracy. It isn't a voice for all people, it's a voice for some. And the rest can just conform. So we go on to various ways that there have been politics surrounding God. Now, I'm not saying it can't happen, I'm not saying it hasn't happened. But when it happens, there is a lawgiver. Now, the lawgiver is God, not in person, via someone else. So it's one person, because he never seems to speak to a group. He may speak to a group, but it's always one law for quite a while. Now, if we have one set of laws that is unchanging, first of all, how do we know we wrote them down right? given human speech and human error and human hearing and human writing and Chinese whispers of writing down one thing, cross-translations, messages over time, losing pages, no page numbers? What if you don't know if you've missed something? What if there is a little clause that God originally said, but human error itself, which we all know exists, we know human error, that's not controversial. What if passing this word of God for thousands and thousands of years causes a mistake? Whose law are we following? Now, even with those slight alterations to the passage of the law, the one law, however long it holds, does not change if it is given by a lawgiver at once. Now, let's just say hypothetically that there's something radical like global warming and the law says everyone has a right to an air conditioner. Now, it's a silly example, I know, but what if that happened? What if we had no carbon trading scheme and we needed to change the laws? What if we needed to amend things? What if we found out things? What if science, heaven forbid, told us something we didn't already know thousands of years ago? Where are we then? Well, we need to change them. Because the world changes, we change, culture changes, and so must the law. So must politics. It is not a static thing. So moving on to the last sentence of the poster, as it were, the existence of God, I guess, should be in here somewhere. So, what is God in politics as a God? If the world is ever changing, if culture moves and politics moves with it, along with the people around it and the world we live in, surely to influence things properly, to have a law which is relevant to a range of politics, he must be interventionist. Otherwise, there is no change in his law or in the actions due to his law. Now, Leibniz suggested that every molecule of the universe had a script from day dot, that everything follows a trajectory, but it didn't really hold up for long. And the reason is that when you have a long script, it has to be somewhere. Information has to be held, and there is no space for the entire existence of every particle within every particle. There is no original script within the world, so it must be outside the world. If he doesn't intervene, we have to wonder where he is in politics. If we are following the law of a God, we have to wonder why this God decided to intervene at the start and didn't come back later. So, let's say he is there. Let's say he's interventionist. Chaos theory. Now, it's largely a metaphor. It doesn't actually need to happen. But it's a comment about the nature of cause and effect. You have one cause, a butterfly flapping its wings, and one event, let's say a hurricane in Bolivia. Now, on face value it seems improbable, but the fact is that any small variation can, in part, cause an enormous change. And, with the larger the variation, the more noticeable the change. You can follow this by chains of cause and effect backwards. You can try and determine what caused things. This is the basic idea of the scientific method. You try to determine what the cause was of an effect. Now, if there is an interventionist God, and God intervenes somewhere outside of the natural laws of science, surely it is going to be larger than a butterfly's wing flap. I assume that's a bit menial for a God. If he's flapping more than butterfly wings, that would probably not only cause more events, such as Bolivian hurricanes, but perhaps something noticeable, something out of place, something that is so contradictory to science, so out of place that you cannot see it again for hundreds of years and have not seen it since. Something that just miraculous. But the strange thing is that for all the miracles that may have been caused by this exact method, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for them that holds the test of time. Now, I don't have time to go through every miracle, but generally, if you have an intervening God on a daily basis who changes people's lives, who affects the physical environment, you have to have some effect beyond that. You have to have something changing the entire interconnected system, because no effect happens without causing ever more effects. So, the infinite regress. Funny crossover. Prime mover was suggested by Thomas Aquinas long, long ago. Say 500 years ago, but that's a guess. Thomas Aquinas suggested that for every cause there is an effect, and for every effect that is in itself a cause, etc., etc., etc. It goes backwards and backwards and backwards until you have an original prime mover. You have the first cause for the first effect that started the chain. Now, he claimed, therefore, there is God, which was a stunning conclusion, and he claimed that was the case because there had to be a prime mover and it may as well be God. But the fact is it may as well be God, because it could, just could, be anything else. If there is such an argument to be had, why is it not the world? Why is it not the universe? Why is it not, say, 5 years ago and we've all had implanted memories? It's some ridiculously arbitrary point to say, long ago, there was a prime mover, and I, right now, will say what it was. I won't explain how, or through what means. I'll just name it. Now, if you have this cause, and caused time, in what medium is it causing? Every action can't happen unless it has time. Moving one's hand. If you have no time, you have no motion. You need time as a medium. So the prime mover, what was he moving through? Cause has no meaning without time, so how do you cause time? Now, this is not an easy question. This is something physicists have been trying to figure out, something philosophers are trying to figure out. And it's something we still struggle with. But naming it doesn't help. Naming it explains nothing. So where is God? The Quran sort of says spiritual realm. Christianity says in the clouds. Judaism kind of agrees. But we'll assume that the whole air flight has gone around in the clouds bit. So where is the spiritual realm? Is it within physics? If it is in the universe somewhere, as a dimension, as something calculable by physics, as something observable, then what is its point? How is it not just redefining physics, renaming it, applying a name to an effect without any explanation? Just as I can say, that's a mystery, and I'll call that mystery Bob, it doesn't help. It doesn't explain the mystery. It doesn't answer the question. So we'll say it's outside of physics. And if it's beyond physics, well, that's a logical fallacy, actually. Because physics, by the nature of it, is what there is. If you are beyond the universe, you are either in another universe in physics, or you don't exist. Physics, by definition, is that which exists. It is the study of existence. If something exists beyond physics, physics grows, because it is the study of what exists. So, there's a logical fallacy named after this called God of the Gaps. If we don't know something, you say God did it. Doesn't answer it, doesn't help, doesn't apply logically. But you can say it. And the funny thing about the God of the Gaps argument is, as you find something in science and reality and the world to fill that gap, by the nature of gaps, you create two more gaps. So you have two more gods, and then you have 6,000 different ways of proving God from what was originally just one, because science helped it along by accidentally proving things and accidentally filling the gap, thereby creating more gaps, so on and so forth. But there's no infinite regresses in the world, of course not. Now, if we have this realm beyond physics, beyond the scientific method, beyond any sort of understanding of cause and effect that maintains rationally, then we may as well throw our shoes out the door. We may as well get out from in the caves, get out from under the shelters, get out from this auditorium, because the world will collapse and we will float away into the gravity because there is no science. Of course not. We've found nothing, because there is nothing except the world out there which shows the success of the scientific method, which applies only on evidence which can be replicated, only on facts which can be proven by logic and rationality alone. As I'm sure Uthman would agree, rationality is a good basis for any argument. Now, how much time do I have?
About 6 minutes.
Sweet. Okay. Well, with an extra 6 minutes, I may as well fill the gap. Now, if, hypothetically, there was a bit of a problem, everyone here has at some point felt something larger than themselves. I would say that definitely, unless you're abnormal, because it's a part of psychology. You do. You feel something larger. You can't explain it, can't name it. Some people like to name things God when they can't name them or explain them, but, you know, that's their choice, as long as it doesn't enter politics. So, what is that? Are you connecting to, sensing, feeling, touching a God? Or are you perhaps experiencing a way that humans have developed to feel society, to connect to politics itself? Let's say hypothetically that instead of God, this is concept B. And this concept B evolved originally so that we could provide for our society and think of it as a being. So that we could calculate what our tribe needs and what it doesn't. So that we could figure out how many berries to pick, how many we need, how many will be needed for the rest of our family. There are many, many reasons. Sorry? There are many, many reasons that we may need this kind of ability. But anthropomorphism seems to apply names to things like this. Aztecs named God the sun when they couldn't figure out what it was. Now, if you do feel God, I don't doubt it. I just doubt its name. Now, if we have a long chain of evolution, which isn't really the debate here, but let's say for the sake of argument that we did evolve, for the sake of science, let's say that this sort of progressed and we started giving traits to this feeling. We started saying, well, it is good to provide berries to the tribe. God is good. We always feel we have to provide berries to the tribe. God is everywhere. Everything I know about God was not told to me. But if it was, he must know everything. He always seems to have the answer, so he must be omniscient. Can I swap into my rebuttal?
So, you're done with your primary argument?
Yeah. Can we call it a fuzzy transition?
Okay, so 10 minutes starting from now.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's say that this God is also, as well as being omniscient and omnibenevolent, he's omnipresent. Because if we can't see him, he may as well be everywhere. Not quite sure I followed that rationality, but that's fine. Point is, we have a trifecta. Now, there's a terrible problem with trifectas. As Uthman may have mentioned in the last bit of his diatribe, that God is one and all and loving and all of these sort of things. Now, the trifecta has various problems, one of which is, quite succinctly, if you're omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent, and can actually affect the world, you have to be without one of these elements, because there are dodgy things happening in the world. Now, if you fit the trifecta, you are either, you know that something bad's happening, but you're not omnibenevolent because you're not doing anything about it, or you don't know it's happening and you're not omniscient. Or you can't get to it in time and you're not omnipresent, or you can't affect it and it's indeterministic. So, just in case someone likes to rely upon the trifecta, doesn't really hold. Alright, now, Uthman Badar attacked weaknesses of the West by pointing out that we do engage in wars and all those kind of maladies of existence, but didn't point out any of the benefits or attack the essence. The essence of democracy is not its faults, but the fact it gives everyone a fair go. The essence of Western economy is not by the nature of Western economy, but by the success of Western economy. It didn't change to take on some old school ideas, it changed to be more successful. As economic theory developed, it went forward, it progressed. It didn't read out of a 1,000-year-old book. If economy did, it wouldn't know anything we find out in the past 1,000 years. There was an idea that when the Enlightenment threw out religion, they threw out the baby with the bathwater, but really, all they threw out was not religion, but a reliance upon God in rational discussion. The reason is because there is always that answer. Always, God did it. Always, my book says. Always, I say so. It's just not good rational argument. So, what about God? Where is he in that? Well, they didn't outlaw religion. They didn't outlaw praise or belief. Those still hold. God's still there, but not in politics and not in the rationality of discussion. You can praise what you want, but not in politics, and not in science. Misery on an untold scale, because he failed to tell you the benefits. It's very easy to untell a scale, it's much harder to tell it. US and Britain, many problems. Most atheistic country, Norway, much fewer problems. Much fewer problems. In fact, I believe some of the least problems. In fact, much fewer problems than any other country, if you look at it in terms of longevity of life, health, a lot of scales of well-being. The general happiness polled on the streets is generally higher, funnily enough. The economy is quite stable. In fact, Norway's pretty great. I kind of wish I was there right now. Alright, so, what is the opposite of God? Maximising personal benefit. Not sure I can agree with this one. Secular? No, that's not what that means. Secular just means without a God. It doesn't mean anything about personal benefit. Democratic? No, actually that's the complete opposite. It's maximising the whole. It's actually trying to make sure everyone is as happy as possible with any sort of decision by actually asking everyone. If it was personal benefit, it would be a dictatorship. Or, one lawgiver. That would be silly. If it's not a God, then it must be God of the self. Why do we need to worship anything? As soon as you worship something, you end up with a tainted, biased, rational opinion. It's just not rational anymore. Suddenly you're not looking at the evidence, the pros, cons, the reason why. You're just saying, I'm doing this for number one, and that number one is whoever I decide. Now, it may be God, maybe yourself, maybe a whole bunch of things, but as soon as you bring worship of any kind, maybe we should call this debate, is there a need for worship? I thought we'd cut to the chase with, is there a need for God in politics? But I'd be happy to branch it out, frankly, because there is no need for worship in politics either. Praise the state? No. Don't do it. God is the only objective basis for morality. Okay, that's a long one, but generally, not necessarily. Kant tried to get some rules down. He did better, frankly, than a lot of the books did. The golden rule is one that's praised as being in a lot of things, but what if you're a masochist? Do unto others as you would do unto yourself. You're going to kill a whole bunch of people. If you're suicidal, even more so. Point is, do unto others as you think they would like. You may be wrong, but you're more right than doing it for yourself. So, basic rule of objective morality, it's not that great. And you can't change it because it's objective. Now, if you have a morality that's actually based on what you know, and it can change with opinion, maybe it has a democratic basis. I don't know. Point is, politics doesn't necessarily rely on morality, it relies on rational debate with morality as one of the premises. Just one. If it's good for everyone, it's good for everyone. Don't judge Islam from another prison. I'm not trying to. I'm trying to assess the relevance of bringing a God into politics. Not actually judging Islam. Alright, criteria for argument, rational. What is reality? Well, reality is what we study it as, and humanity has called that study science. They have called the study of a God theology. Just saying, two different fields. Cohesive. Well, the trifecta can't exist. The omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent. So, cohesion, might lose some marks there. Consistency. How many literal fundamentalists are there in any one faith? Because I'm pretty sure it's less than half. So, consistency. Follow some rules, not others. Which ones? Up to you. Not exactly consistent. Islam unifies rationality and the God, etc., 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 personal with political, etc., etc. Okay, cool. Good. Doesn't rely on God to do that. If it does, it only does it as well as we are already doing. So, okay. No time for evidence. No time for evidence. Okay, well, the problem with forming a rational argument on one source is that it's exactly that. The reason a secular state can form a better rational argument for any sort of political debate without incorporating God is that because we can use many sources. The book, the holy book, the Bible. Sorry?
1 minute.
Okay. The Holy Bible for atheism and rational debate is the sum total of human knowledge. Didn't stop 1,000 years ago. Didn't stop 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. It did not stop. It does not stop today. It may change tomorrow. That's the risk you take for accuracy. That is getting close to reality, and that is why we do not have God in politics. So, the dependence upon water, prime mover rebranded, but the rest falls away. I'm done.
Okay, let's take this forward. I had a couple of slides I probably want to show. Not that I was able to read Joseph's mind, but just that some of the refutations are predictable. So I might just spend about 5 minutes on this, and when Friedel says 5, I'll go back to 3 or 4 slides that I think are important on this topic. But just to do some of the points that were made in no particular order. The starting out, the sort of question to start, if it's like this and if it's like that, and if human beings change and this, just logically, those questions are, we say, logically posterior to the question of the existence of God. Meaning, in simple English, you have to either say, you have to have an answer to the question first before we go on to reconcile that answer with our perception of reality. There's no point in me ignoring the question and then saying, well, if it's like this, then what? If God exists, let's move forward. If He doesn't, there's no question of well, what about human error? Right? It works that way. Not, well, if there's human error, and what you're trying to do is imply it doesn't exist, therefore. It just doesn't work that way in terms of logical structures. We can entertain it, of course. Anyway, there was also a lot of what we call appeals to consequence, which again don't prove anything. It's just scare tactics. Religious people use them more. But I think the atheists have picked up on it, perhaps. If things are changing and God stopped 2,000 years ago, what's going to happen? It doesn't matter what's going to happen. It doesn't prove or disprove whether He exists or not. He brought up the Mormons. I don't know why. I don't agree with them either. In fact, I agree they don't have a basis. A bit of a straw man. My argument is any claim whatsoever about God, about anything, has to have a basis, has to have rational proof. Right? I gave mine. It was not really attended to, but anything else, I agree the Mormons don't have a basis. Let's move on. People abuse God. George Bush, yeah, they do. People abuse a lot of other things as well. And so that's the point. On a lot of these points, they're right, but they equally apply to the alternative. So in terms of politics, it's either, in terms of what we're saying, it's either God or human beings. Right? It's got, either we refer to God or human beings. There can be variations, but that's what we're arguing here. And so if humans abuse God, they can abuse themselves, and they do. Right? And so if there have been wars on the basis of whispers in George Bush's ear, there's been wars where they have no reference to God whatsoever. Right? In fact, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in human history. And predominantly it was secular. World War I was secular, World War II was secular. In terms of, it didn't really have any basis in God, arguments about God. Right, so either way, that doesn't really prove anything. And there was a number of points of which I want to get to the base. Right? So for example, democracy is a voice for everyone. If you put sort of, secularism allows everyone to have a voice, but if you put a religion, there's a great conflation here when we use the word religion, and it's assumed to be something separate, right? When we talk about religion or something else, any other ideology, they are claims to a worldview, right? They're claims to what is the reality, origin of the world, purpose in life, whatever the question may be. They are answers to these questions. There's no difference. I just you say religion, and then you start making claims about conformity. So secularism, capitalism, democracy are claims to a certain worldview. If they're in power, I have to conform. I don't agree with secularism. I have to conform in Australia. Right? There are rules in Islamic law which are not allowed here. I conform. So it applies equally both ways. And therefore it's not an argument to say religion does this, but something else doesn't do that. That's why if we in fact drop the word religion and just talk about ideologies or ideas, right, or worldviews, we would cut to the chase. There's a point about people change, cultures change. Again, there's details here, but I would argue the essence of these things do not change. The essence of the human being does not change. Styles, means, ways of doing things change. And that's important in this discussion, but a slightly different point. A lot of issues are made about cause and effect, and other things that I didn't mention. I don't recall making anything about cause and effect as such. In fact, I wanted to avoid that because we get into these issues. But just since it has been mentioned, and really in empirical thought, the scientific method depends quite heavily on this assumption of cause and effect. There is issues with that need to be considered, which are that, as Joseph said, that causes have an effect. So if God's sort of outside and is coming in, there should be other effects. Again, that's just a pure assumption about the way things work. So you're assuming that there's physics here. It works by itself, and then there's God. And so if He's coming into physics, there should be something else happening. That's just a way of looking at it, right? But if you start on the first basis and said, okay, does He exist or not? Yes, He exists. How do things work? This is how they work. And then you move forward. So the laws of science are not separate. They're laws put in place by, just like everything else, all the other attributes and things, by God. Having said that, again, I think a lot of the time Joseph was sort of holding on to words. Words are used to express meanings. It's the meanings that are important, right? So it's not about the word God. We can change that. People use different words, but they use God in Arabic anyway. In French, don't use the word God. It's about the meaning, right? So it's not. So I would agree if the prime mover argument, which again I didn't use, but Aquinas used it, and he said, okay, first mover has to be God. That will be wrong. I haven't said that. I've said that this thing is dependent, and it has to have something where how far you want to go back, it has to be independent. And by rational extension, it has to be A, B, C, D. You can call that God, you can call it whatever you want, but it's that meaning, it's that concept that is important. And so coming back, cause and effect is actually not, empiricism uses it, but it's not provable, even by empiricism itself. You can't prove it. Because something can cause an effect, or the two phenomena can simply happen as a correlation. Right? There's no way for us to prove that it's actually cause and effect except through induction, which is always deficient because we can't do a thing, n number of times to keep doing it. Right? And so, in fact, even from this perspective, the Islamic argument is stronger because we're saying these things, these attributes occur in correlation to each other by external imposition. By external imposition, and that's the true cause. That's the true cause. Trifecta, I didn't mention trifecta. I actually didn't use the word omnibeneficent in my entire talk. Christians use that argument. So another, there's a straw man. Success of the economy, again, I don't deny success of the economy, but we have to look at it at the expense of what? That's what I was emphasising. It's at the expense where the success really comes into great disrepute. But just before I finish, if I can go back to a couple of slides. I think they're important. Sorry, F5. Oh, no. And that's just to sort of, again, just answer some of the points made anyway. But it's about the inadequacy of the atheist narrative again. But although Joseph has already admitted that they don't have an answer to what was before. A point was made about time, that things have to happen in time. Again, all of that is by the scientific method which applies within space-time. Right? And what we're doing, what my argument does is to prove that there is something beyond this. There has to be something beyond this. And therefore, to ask a question even like, well, what about time, is a non-question. Because that is within the universe and God is beyond that. So there's no answer, and that's important because I said we need to act on the basis of reality, but you don't have an answer to the reality. All you have is explanations of what happened from the Big Bang, which is the most accepted theory, onwards. So even evolution is not an important discussion here. All evolution does is tell us how life from that point has come to this point, right? But it doesn't tell us what happened before that. More importantly, there are a number of leaps of faith in atheism as well, right? Because overall narrative, implicitly, if not explicitly, is that human beings are just accidental byproducts of matter plus time plus chance. We've evolved relatively recently on a very, very small speck of dust, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe, doomed to eventually perish, right? Mankind is a doomed race in a dying universe. This is the implication.
1 minute.
So we come from nothing, we're going nowhere, for no specific purpose. That's nice. Again, if I went from that and said, therefore God exists, that would be fallacious. I'm not doing that. What I'm saying is, what it implies, and this is what I'm talking about consistency. Again, Joseph misinterpreted my point about consistency. Because it means, you say this is the reality, and so this. If that's the reality, we should end up saying that do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. Right? Why try to be good at the expense of your personal benefit? Right? Why care about the collective? Why try to convince others of atheism? They're going to end up being nothing. Right? So when they're nothing, you're going to say, oh, well, I was an atheist whilst I was relatively nothing. Right? Why live at all? Really, why live at all? And in fine print, I just have that this is not a call for atheists to take their lives. it is a non-redeemable, non-exchangeable invitation to think about the rational implications of their beliefs, and relatives of staff need not apply. But I'll stop there because my time's over. The only point was about, again, the consistent point. There's leaps of faith. You have to adopt the noble lie, as Ru says, to actually have a cohesive existence on this earth. Thank you.
Okay, so the next session will be the 2.5-minute responses from both speakers. The first speaker will be Uthman. In the meantime, though, I'd like for some of the volunteers to come up, and they'll be handing out palm cards with pens for any questions that you may have. So please write them down and keep them succinct, straight to the point, and please write clearly who you are addressing with the question. So you can write your questions down while we have our concluding remarks. So after the concluding remarks, we'll get straight into the Q&A session. And as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the questions will be in written form. And if time permits, we'll open the floor for oral questions. Okay, so I'd like to call Uthman, speaker A, to give his 2.5-minute concluding remark.
Okay, I'll take about 2 of those 2.5 minutes. Again, I just reiterate my argument again, so we don't sort of lose the forest for the trees. As human beings, social creatures who live in societies and seek a harmonious existence in societies, we need certain values that will allow for this. They need to be built on the basis of a rational assessment of the reality, right? And obviously, there's different realities and different levels, right? But here I'm meaning you have to obviously start from the most basic and most broad reality and then move forward to other ones. And so what I put forward for you is a very solid argument, and again, I would appreciate if questions are about the argument that I put forward, not what someone did hundreds of years ago, right? I put a solid argument, it's completely rational, on that basis that this is the reality, and going forward by extension, this is what should be done. Obviously, in terms of religion, that's not the debate doesn't end there, because revelation and that all comes into it. Again, we don't allow leaps of faith. Even in Revelation, there has to be proof that it's from God. Having proof that God exists, you can't just say, well, this is from Him. Right? And so, in fact, that answers the question that Joseph raised. Well, which one? What interpretation? Although, again, that applies equally to following human beings and the thousands of ideologies that they've come up with over time. So that's sort of an argument. Last point would just be to keep the implications in mind. Sometimes, again, when I say act on the basis of reality, it's as opposed to your whims, or as opposed to non-evidence-based conjecture, speculation. And remember the implications, both in this world and the next, because whenever you get the reality wrong, there are implications in any field of decision-making. And obviously, in the next world, which assumes the revelation and that sort of whole argument, which you can't go into today, there's obviously a consequence as well. But that's all I have to call for. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to kill myself. That should be a relief to all of you out there. Basically, we rely on what we're provided for in this life and don't rely on what's given to us after it. Basically, God doesn't have a place in politics because, to sum up, politics should be for all the people. God can be interpreted various ways. God doesn't actually need to be proven in reality for a religion to hold as a religion, but for a rational argument to hold, it needs more than the requirements of a religion. They are two separate arguments, two separate fields, which is why politics often talks past religion when it's talking about things that aren't written in books. We're of a sacred variety. So basically, the point is, follow politics for the people that live here today and don't appeal beyond it. That's about it.
So we're sorting out the questions. The speakers will be given 1 minute each to answer the questions. In the meantime, you would have seen one of these around the tables in front of you. This is basically the schedule for SUMSA's Islamic Awareness Week this year. This year, it's not exactly an Islamic Awareness Week, but more of an Islamic Week and a half. Islamic Awareness Week and a half. So we're at our third event. We have an event on tomorrow, and then we have another set of lectures on next week from Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So please try to attend these and spread the word. So I think now we should be. Okay, so the first question will be to Joseph. If we don't have to worship anything or God, then what is our purpose in life? Why are we here for? Aren't we meant to thank the Creator who created us?
Excellent. Now, very, very common question. That's fair enough. It does actually take a couple of presuppositions. Basically, you have a purpose for a hammer because you make a hammer for a purpose. You don't have a purpose for a stone unless you find a purpose for a stone. Stones have no intrinsic purpose. To ask what the meaning and purpose of life is to presuppose that we were created. If we weren't created, then we make our own purpose. The purpose of our life is what we define, and I think a good idea would probably be to live it for the benefit of your family, your society, people around you. Probably try not to diminish yourself too much, but you don't need to be a martyr. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to be a good person. And frankly, that is about it. If there was no creator who created us, then you do not need to appease him. For the second part of that question. And why are we here for? I think I covered that. Might look at your grammar, but yeah. Sorry.
The next question for Uthman. Does God intervene Does God intervene into politics? If yes, who is supposed to interpret his intervention? And what is the criterion of true interpretation?
Thank you for that question. The whole again, that word intervention is perhaps throwing us off a little bit here. It's got more theological implications than political ones. Our argument is that politics is management of people's affairs, right? As human beings, we determine a reality and then judge how we're going to go on that basis, right? If we say God exists, He sends down revelation, which has within it laws and principles and morals and frameworks. These are to be followed. There's a question of interpretation. Yes, there are rules of interpretation which experts in the field, scholars in the field come up with. The important point, however, in a debate is that this is no different, again, to any other intervention in politics. Right? So let's say, got out of the picture, they're human beings. Human beings come up with ideas. They come up with different ideas. They write texts. People come later and interpret those texts. We can ask the same question, who does it? Right? So Machiavelli can write a text and a prophet can claim he's got a text. Both need to be interpreted, right? And we're going to interpret it here and now. So both have rules of interpretation. Anyone who studied law knows that a legal interpretation is a bit of a tricky one. It's complex. So that's the more important point here. Same thing with human error. It's just that we need to keep the scale balanced on both sides.
To Joseph, if we challenge the existence and laws of God on the basis of rationality and science, that the existence and laws itself, have been propelled by a human, and there is a human error in everyday life. Why do we rely or believe on science when that same science is developed by scientists who are themselves humans? Sorry for that.
English classes for everyone. Compulsory.
We'll see how the atheists go. Now, basically, the scientific method, which you must not be versed in, tries to account for human error. It takes human error into account with every analysis. Basically, when we make a claim, we make sure that it can stand the test of repetition, it can stand the test of what is likely to be due to chance, all those kind of things. We try and eliminate human error as much as possible, and then only those do we use as the foundation for further evidence. Okay. Are you implying that humans created humans from the start? Okay.
I think he's using your argument about how God is interpreted by man as being, so science is interpreted by man too.
Oh, thank you.
So what's your question?
No. Yeah, so basically, science is made by men who realize their shortcomings, and God would be made by men who do not, who don't change for thousands of years, but reinterpret the same things. So even though the book doesn't change, sure, interpretations do, but is that enough? And does it have a method to it? And can you interpret it in any particular way? That's the real question.
To Uthman, considering your only justification for the rationality of Islam is the argument of infinite regress, why is Muhammad's claim to be a prophet of God so much more credible than Joseph Smith?
John Smith, was it? Okay. Oh, Joseph.
No, I know it's my name.
Okay. Well, I haven't answered that question. I haven't said otherwise. Just that wasn't the topic of the debate. Certainly, as I said, once we prove the existence of God, which was today's question, we do need to move forward and talk about any claims of revelation. Again, needs substantiation, and any distinction in this regard about a claim made from John or John. Do you think it is right?
It's John.
Are there any moments in? John or anyone else or any other prophet, any distinction will be based on how that is substantiated. So certainly we can present an argument for why we believe the Quran is revelation from God, and then it can be assessed on its merits, but it's just that wasn't the discussion of today's topic, and hence we can go down that path. But just it points to evidence, substantiation, and not just filling in the gaps or leaps of faith or anything of the like.
So next question for Joseph. Do you consider Darwin's theory to be more cause and effect based on correlation of basis? That's the first question. Second question, if we can apply Darwin's theory to theory of origin of universe, how would it differ with his original origin of species theory, which refers to earthly species?
I like that question. Okay, cool. Okay, co-relational based. Correlational based, I think. Okay, right. I think that's what I meant to write. Okay, Darwin's theory is not correlationally based. It's actually based on making predictions and filling out predictions, which have been, filled out. Basically, it has stood the test of time in terms of the scientific theory, and it's not Darwin's theory, it's Darwin's theory of evolution. And it has been altered a little there, here and there, because it's science and not doctrine. The second question is, just to summarise the first one, no, it's not correlational. It is more cause and effect based. Second question, can you apply Darwin theory to origin of the universe? No, you can't. It's different parameters. Darwin's theory of evolution is based on the progression of genes, and the origin of the universe is based on thermodynamics. How does it differ? Basically, origin of species takes traits and develops them when they are good for an environment. The origin of the universe moved out by the rules of thermodynamics and the various laws of physics. Darwin's theory does adhere to the laws of physics, but it doesn't change the smaller details of it. One is very, very intricate, based on the way life works, and one is very large and based on how the universe in itself works. So that's the difference between them. I don't know what this question has to do with the debate, but alright, cool. But I answered them anyway.
Assuming the existence of God, why does it follow? Why does it follow that we can interpret divine will? How does it follow that this will should be enacted through politics that has real effect over people's lives and bodies?
We can. Okay. Again, I wouldn't start on that basis of going backwards. If God exists, would claim the revelation, substantiated. Obviously, we haven't done that. And now this, as a natural extension, needs to be interpreted. Humans will interpret it, but that's not so much of an issue as it's being made out to be, because the communication is in the human language. And so humans will interpret it. There will be differences of opinion. It's not that big an issue. Again, however, I would stress, and again, so the question is why does it come into politics affecting the lives of people? Oh my God. The point is, there's no different if you have humans instead of God. Right? I appreciate this point that if the alternative does not answer these questions any better, not that they're an issue, right? But it's equal. It applies equally. So you have a human. He says, "I come with a really good idea, Darwin or whatever it is." Right? There's human error. Science accounts for it. Yeah, it does. Or someone else writes a philosophical text, a political text. Right? This is how ideas come. The ideas that the Western world is built upon are based in the Enlightenment and the Reformation. Right? There's texts that are followed. They need to be interpreted. They affect the lives of people. What's the difference? Therefore, again, our question is, which assessment of reality is correct? Is it the one that says God may exist, but what's important is just keep him aside? That makes no sense. If he exists with given attributes, he must have a role. If he doesn't exist, he has no role. And in this regard, communism is closer to the truth than liberalism is. It's just ignoring the question. It's just saying it may exist, up to you, you can believe it, but it shouldn't come into politics. Right, so waste your time on the weekend, but just don't waste our time. That's irrational.
Considering we don't have much time left, I'm going to skip to the more relevant questions to the motion today. So, Joseph, how can you claim that democracy is about providing a fair go for all, when since the inception of Western liberalism, it has been the means by which middle high-class white men protect their own beliefs and interests. You might argue that this is not what democracy should be, but it is clear that if democracy exists only in normative ideals, then it does not exist at all.
I would agree. Basically, democracy as an idea applies to different degrees depending on how you apply it. There are religious democracies, there are democracies that people attempt, there are full democracies, well not many actually, but you can try. And really the amount of democratic right you give to people is how often the vote is, etc., etc. But the place that capitalism has tainted democracy the most and given middle-class white men the right to do things is in places like the US, where it is a more religious democracy than a normal democracy. It's largely the fact that it isn't being held to democracy. I would agree that that is not close to democracy, sure, but it's because it's been closer to a religious democracy where power is given to the word of God than it is to the people. I assume you were trying to agree with me, or was that a question? I'm not sure.
So Uthman, keeping to the theme of religion in politics, you criticise secular Western democracy for supporting heinous despots, such as the leaders of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and Pervez Musharraf. How would you respond to the assertion that all three of these, and especially Wahhabi Saudi Arabia, are societies in which religion does influence politics?
Well, it certainly may be the case that there's an influence, but as Joseph said, he thinks in the US it's the same thing, right? So that's not the determining factor here. When we talk about Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Pakistan, the essence of their forms of politics are not based on Islam whatsoever. Right? Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, 80-90% secular. Pakistan's, well, it's a democracy now. It's been a dictatorship, sort of comes in and out of those phases. Egypt is a complete dictatorship. Hosni Mubarak gets 99% of the votes every time there's an election, once every 10 years. It's got nothing to do with Islam. And this is one of the points that unfortunately blurs the debate, or the political debate in terms of Islam and its role in politics, is that there's again myths peddled about the reality. The reality is all the rulers in the Muslim world, without exception, are not on the side of the Muslims wanting Islamic political manifestation from the Caliphate. They're on the side of the Western governments, they're puppets. They've been put in place. Anyone that knows the history of World War I, after World War I, these lands were divided by Sykes-Picot, by the Treaty of Lausanne, and so forth. So we need to get the facts right in terms of who stands where and what's happening. There's always going to be crossover. You don't have a bit of democracy here. In Islam, you have representative government in terms of people being allowed to choose who rules them. And that's why on this part I disagree with Joseph's understanding of democracy. The central tenet of which is not that everyone gets a vote, that's fair, but it is that people are sovereign. Democracy comes from the Greek demos kratos, that the demos, the citizenry, has sovereignty. That's a central concept. That's why the idea of a religious democracy is a bit of an oxymoron.
To Joseph, this card has two questions, but I think I'll just ask the first one. In your argument, you mention again and again, whose law are we following? Can you answer your own question? Can you tell us any all-inclusive, perfect law made by human beings?
I believe the idea is that we modify law to get towards perfection, but we never attain it. The idea that you can have a perfect law is in itself a fallacy. Whose laws are we following was my question, because I was asking, basically, if we are endlessly reinterpreting God, as you said, then to what end? What basis, what criteria, to whose benefit? Basically, if we are using the democratic political system that is often used in the West, where we are refining laws for the benefit of the people, that's all well and good. We may never get a perfect law, but at least we're getting towards there. If we do it for the benefit of God, we don't know whether we're interpreting God right in the first place.
Man, do we need a religion to live life with a purpose? Don't you personally think or believe that human morality is sufficient to say live better and live better lives and humans without any divine intervention are beautiful enough to treasure themselves? Why does someone need to believe his life is given at the expense of some God? God's intention to carry on living. Isn't it an obvious sense of insecurity, cluelessness, and uncertainty?
Good question. Again, however, as I said, when we approach, again, if our basis is rationality, we need to approach things in a structured manner with things in their place. You don't ask the question, this question, before asking the question, does God exist? Right? Either he exists and then we move forward, or he doesn't exist and we move forward. Right? Not, well, can't we do it this way? And if we can do it that way, then what does that imply about God? We're going backwards. Right? We're going to go from 0 to 1 to 2 and so forth. And so that question is ignoring, or it's going to conflate various realities on the ground. Can human beings live a life, good lives without divine intervention? Again, on the practical, I would probably argue, we can speculate, yes, no, maybe, history is probably testament that it's going to be difficult, but rationally looking at the question, we're not going to be able to come up with a consistent, cohesive, rational set of values that are based in reality. That's the point. So we can say, okay, let's get together in this room and decide on values. What's moral and what's good and evil? What's our basis? What is our basis? What I say and what you say? Right? And going back to the narrative, if God is out of the picture, we are nothing. We were just being by chance. Time and matter. We're going nowhere. We come from nowhere for no purpose. So we should. I'm obliged, because all of you guys with no purpose, who have come from nowhere and going nowhere, think that I should not kill people. You know, and this is the point. People will not kill people because things don't work properly. But this is in the back of their mind, and eventually, when the values are pushed towards individualism, maximising personal benefit, etc., you'll get the results that we are getting, and we're only increasing in that direction.
No way.
To Joseph, rational argument is recognizing that man has limitations. These limitations extend far and beyond our mind. Can you entertain the thought of man discovering this spiritual realm in which God exists in the future? That is, once we have the means in doing so?
Entertain the thought of discovering the spiritual realm. What would that mean for religion? If you suddenly found God and he was in a realm sitting there, what would that mean? Well, I can entertain the thought, certainly. Sure. It's hell of a thought. Very interesting thought. What's the benefit of entertaining? Is there a constructive aspect to this? I assume you're trying to say that this spiritual realm could be discovered by men? Yep, I get that, but what's the point? I'm not quite sure I understand the point of the question.
I think the point was if someone came up to evidence some magical miracle happened doing scientifically rigorous, then would you believe?
If the spiritual realm were discovered by physical means, it would be part of physics. That would mean that we would then study it and properly understand God, and not make assumptions like we must have done up until now. If it's in the physical realm and we haven't yet discovered it. It's like me saying, well, let's say that there is a planet out there full of gold. Now let's burn all our gold because it's out there and we've reclaimed. I don't have to provide evidence that it's there, or means of ways to get there, or anything like it. But let's plan for it. Yeah. Let's write books about this spiritual realm. Let's discuss this spiritual realm. It may be theirs one day.
Okay. Considering we have 5 minutes left, we'll just leave it to 2 last questions. So, Uthman, mosque after mosque is built in Britain, yet time and again Saudi Arabia has prohibited the building of churches. What does this say about religious freedom in a Muslim government compared to a secular one, or a secular state?
Okay, that's a good question, but the last one, I just had a point about the previous discussion. I made a point in my slides about the difference between empirical and rational thought, and again, it seems to come through here where even though irrational evidence has been put forth, it's being said, no, well, we want scientific evidence. But it does have the limitations of science. And again, I'm not saying science is a bad thing, that shouldn't go across. It's a very good thing, but in its place, which you only know by understanding its nature and limitations. One of which is that you can only come up with, use a scientific method on something that is perceivable, testable, you can play around with it. You know, the scientific experiments you did in high school, hypothesis testing, blah, blah, blah. But we cannot restrict knowledge to this method of thought. There are things that can be proven outside of this. Right? Very simple examples. If someone here hasn't been to China, for example, you've never been to China, without going there, without sensing it directly, it can be proven to you by numerous reports of people who have gone there. Right?
It's the scientific method though. Like, the hypothesis is that China exists, and so I say that, and then I call someone in China. That's the scientific method.
And also, can we
but
answer
you have
questions?
Just keep it.
Yeah,
Just keep it to
your
the
questions.
Sorry.
Yeah, let it go. On next, your question.
The question was about freedom of religion and the comparison between Britain and Saudi Arabia. There's a number of points that have been made. Number one, the current situation in the Muslim world doesn't represent the Islamic reality. Notwithstanding that there are certain rules that are different, but again, here, as I said, there is no basis of measuring Islamic law, any aspect thereof, on the basis of some other ideology. So if you think freedom of religion is a really good thing, doesn't mean that becomes correct, and therefore, now you're going to make this a standard and say, well, why aren't you doing this? Right? No, it depends on the reality. That's why. It's not about what I think or what you think. If God exists, if He has said this, again, Athiest substantiated, then that is what needs to be done. Right? If it's not, then we can go on to other things. But it's not a case of, well, this is what we believe, and we're going to impose this on others. And that's naturally what happens. The other important question here is, we don't judge things by 1 law or 2 laws or 3 laws. For example, there are certain people who are against the capital punishment. And in the US, there is capital punishment. But to conclude, these people to conclude from there that therefore, the civilization of America is barbaric, would be a bit of a stretch. It's not about 1 law or 2 laws. It's number one about the foundations. Where do these laws come from? The fundamental values and their rational substantiation. And then we can go look at least a cross-section, unselective of the laws.
Last question to Joseph. If atheism... If atheism is a good way of living, then what are the solutions to the problems such as gambling, homosexuality, abortions, and alcoholic rates in most of the Western countries? How come politics or democracy cannot solve them?
For the sake of Islamic awareness week, we probably shouldn't go into such subjects. No. If we start bringing up this sort of stuff, then it may get dirty. No. Okay. No. Ask me after.
You be available after?
Yeah. I'll be available after, sure.
Okay. Alright, thank you, Joseph and Uthman. So the debate has concluded. Both speakers will be available